Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Good evening. Welcome to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Lindsay Davis Stover. This evening we have joining us my good friend, Joan Lewis Osborne. Joan is an AP government teacher in Loudoun County, in which she's taught AP government for over 13 years. And prior to teaching government, she was a lawyer at a Wall Street law firm and also at 2 Fortune 500 companies. Joan is a lifelong Democrat, and Joan and I work together as volunteers organizing the Kids for Biden group that we just started about a week ago. Joan, thanks so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's exciting. I know we kicked off our first Kids for Biden event on Friday. Tell us a little bit how this all started and why this is so important to get kids involved right now.
Well, I really love teaching kids of all ages. I teach seniors now, but I've taught all the way from middle school through 12th grade. And I think it's so important to teach our kids about the values that our nation was founded on. And when the Biden campaign reached out and you had the idea for Kids for Biden, I thought it was the greatest idea to get kids involved and to show them, what it's like to be involved in your community and involved, hopefully, later on, voting themselves.
Absolutely. And we had our first kickoff event on Friday. For those viewers that weren't able to join us, but hopefully many will in the future, can you talk a little bit about the event?
So we had thrown around a couple ideas about what we might discuss at our first meeting, but then it turned out that our first meeting was going to be on Juneteenth, and the governor of Virginia had just declared that he was going to make Juneteenth a statewide holiday. So we thought it would be a great idea to discuss the history behind Juneteenth and what led up to it, and then discuss a little bit about the traditions of Juneteenth.
Well, how many kids would you say joined us?
Well, I think there were at least 50, but there were parents there as well, and maybe even some grandparents. So it seems like, altogether there might have been over 100 people.
Well, and what I thought was so cool is you started seeing people show up on this Zoom screen. And while we had reached out mostly to families in Virginia just to kick off this event, what was so exciting was there were families who were logging in from all over the country. And that was incredible to see. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I love that. The fact that both of us put it up on our Facebook pages, and then we had friends. I had friends from when I lived in Minnesota several years back come on. I had friends from college tell other friends about it and come on, and you had a lot of friends too from different places in the country. So I think we covered several different states, even though we had just planned on Virginia in the beginning.
We sure did. And I mean, what I think was so remarkable about this was, we had talked about things that we could do, and we had an incredible support from the Biden campaign too, and putting all of this together. And it was one of those things that just happened. And what I thought was so incredible was how organic it really was. We came together to have a really, in many ways, tough discussion about what is going on in our country right now. And to see the enthusiasm on the screen from kids from 2 years old to high school kids, like you said, to families, grandparents, I mean, it was just really incredible. It was an incredible way to really bring people together around education, because you did a fantastic lesson. As we stated before, you're a household name in our house, Mrs. Joan. But it was just so remarkable to see how education in so many ways can bring people together from many different generations. Can you talk a little bit about the power of education in terms of making sure people really understand the significance of what's going on right now?
Well, I had a lot of friends my age, sort of in their early 50s, some that I'd gone to high school with, some that I hadn't, some that I work with, who just said, we didn't study any of this when we were in school. And I even looked at the history books that we use right now, and none of them mention Juneteenth. The three that I looked through, none of them mention it. So, I mean, I know there's so much American history to study, but I think it's really important, especially with what's going on right now in our country, with race relations and relations with police, that it's really important to understand the history, because I don't think you can really understand what's happening in the United States today if you don't understand the history of slavery, the end of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the civil rights movement and what came after it.
Well, and you make such an incredible point. And I'd love for you to spend some time talking about what we discussed, because I think the conversations that we had on Friday with elementary age kids, right up to high school, were conversations that most adults, unfortunately, are not having right now. Can you talk a little bit? I know we went through a fantastic lesson that you presented. Can you give us, though, a kind of a summary of what that was? I'd love to, in a sense, on this show, talk a little bit about that education, because you're right. So much of it is not in our history books right now.
Sure. I probably gave a much longer lecture than I had planned to.
It was awesome.
But we started with 1619, with the first Africans coming to Virginia, and the fact that eventually out of those first Africans, we ended up with, institutionalized slavery in the United States. And then we talked a lot about around the time of the Revolution and what our founding fathers, a lot of them also being from Virginia, like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Patrick Henry, what they were saying about freedom and liberty and wanting to be free from the British, but then at the same time, there was the paradox of them owning slaves. And then we talked about the fact that there was some hope that maybe slavery would end around the time of the Revolution, but then it just became more entrenched and ended up in civil war in the 1860s. And then we talked about the Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln made in 1863, and how it didn't really free anyone. And that's something that I never found out until I was in college. Like, I'm sure in high school they just told us the Emancipation Proclamation freed all the slaves. But that's why Juneteenth became so important, because in the 1860s, the southern states that hadn't been taken over by the Union still had their slaves. And it was only as the Union advanced that slavery eventually ended in the Confederate States. But then, of course, Texas was the last holdout. So we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yes. Well, that's what I thought was so remarkable. I mean, one, I was so impressed with the kids that participated, because this wasn't just a webinar series where you talked at them, right? I mean, this was a really interactive discussion. And you asked some pretty hard questions of these kids. And I was monitoring the chat box for us, trying to, make sure that those answers got to you. And I have to say, I was so impressed with the historical knowledge that so many of these kids knew already. And, I think you and I both heard from so many parents after the event on Friday about the discussions that this particular event was spurring around the dinner table and families, not just in Virginia, but all over the country. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of those conversations right now?
Yes, I mean, I think if you can have a conversation with your kids about something that deals with history and race, you should grab it. Like, if your kid brings up an issue at the dinner table, you should talk about it. Because they're giving you an in into talking about some of the most important issues that are happening in the country today. And so some parents feel really conflicted. They don't know how to bring it up, or they don't know when to bring it up. But, if you have a kid and they're going to a history class and they hear a history lecture and then they have a question, that to me is the time to really start talking about it and start talking about race, because it's very important that kids understand the history so that they can understand what's going on today and not be confused. And then it also affects their interaction with other kids and with other people in the community. And so I think that's a very important point, that it's actually talked about.
What I know, you and I have had this discussion several times now about parents really struggling with how to have these conversations. And I know many parents would love to be able to ask an AP government teacher, how do I talk about these things? And we've shared some personal stories of how we've done that in our own families. But can you talk a little bit about, how to have these conversations? Because I think not having these conversations is not an option right now. Can you talk about some of the conversations maybe that you've had with your children, and what are ways in which parents can talk more openly and honestly about what's going on right now?
I think, it depends on the age of the children. So with my sons when they were younger, I maybe didn't have as frank a discussion as I do now with regard to what is going on, because I mean that now they are two teenage African American males. One of them drives. And so, I want them to be aware of the things that can arise. But when they're small, I think it's just important to, even in the literature that you read to your children, to have diverse faces and diverse voices. And, not just read all the same things, and let them see different people in different cultures. I think that really helps. I think it helps when they have friends that are from different cultures. And if they ask questions about race or ask questions about culture, I think it's important to talk to them, on their level about that, and let them know, everyone is equal and the same. People come from different places. People have different skin colors, people eat different things, people practice religion in different ways, but that's okay. Like, that's what America's all about. And just, hopefully let them know that they should embrace that. I mean, I think that's what parents need to be doing at a very young age with children.
Absolutely. And it was fun to see on the screen on Friday, so many kids that we know, right?
Yeah.
And we've seen at marches, whether I saw some at the Fairfax County NAACP March, I've seen many at the McLean March, and I know you've seen some as well. Can you talk about, these discussions are important, but so is action. And can you talk a little bit about what that action could look like when you're involving students and kids as we move forward?
Well, I love the idea that you had about having the kids make postcards and sending them out to remind people to vote, because I think it's so much stronger when that postcard that you get in the mail isn't from a campaign, necessarily isn't from a specific candidate, but it's actually a kid that wrote the postcard and is telling you to go and vote. I mean, to me, that would have a huge impact. And I'm so proud of these kids for doing those things. And also the kids that are going to protests. I mean, they're concerned. A lot of parents say they're the ones who wanted to go to the protest. They're the ones who talked to me about it. And so they're bringing their parents along because they're concerned about what the world's going to look like, when they become adults. So I think that is a wonderful way for kids to get involved as well. And I also like the fact that we have so many of these groups in the middle schools and the high schools that are involved in the party politics, because that's a huge piece of it in the United States as well. And at least I know the Virginia young Democrats and the kids that are in the organizations in their schools are aware of that as well. And so they're getting started in party politics, which I think is wonderful at that age.
It's exciting because, so many of the marches that are happening all over our communities are actually being organized by students right now. And a lot of the activism that you see online, right, is being orchestrated by students in such a brilliant and thoughtful way. And so for me, seeing the screen on Friday and hearing all of the, activism that's going online and in our communities, it gave me so much hope for not only November, but beyond, right? And I think that's part of kind of what is motivating people right now is the younger generations and their need and their push and their demand for change.
That's so true. One of my friend's daughters, who was on the call, said to her mom, she's like, this is what we're doing right now. She's like, I'm going to all the Black Lives Matter marches because they're the community that needs our help now. And originally, she was more of a climate activist. So I thought it was really neat that she said that. She's like, these are the people who need our focus right now, so this is what I'm doing. But it gives me hope that, when this is not what needs the focus, when the environment needs the focus, or when women's right needs the focus, then these kids are going to be there marching and writing and urging legislators to make a change.
Well, and that's such an incredible point, because we saw during, right after, I guess, the election, right? We saw women's marches all over the country spur up. And so many of them were led by young people as well. And, we have also seen, the brilliance of the activism among young people in terms of ensuring gun safety, and the movement that they have pushed, from, every corner of this country has really impacted change in so many ways. And so I love hearing that young people right now in particular are recognizing what is the need and the focus, and they are making sure that they give everything they have to that movement. And I think that's an incredible thing to see.
It is.
Well, one of the things I love that we did is on Friday, and you had mentioned the postcard. We really stressed the importance, while many of the people on our call were not old enough to vote, right? We stressed the importance of voting, and there is no age requirement for activism, right? And so we had all of the kids make a vote sign, and we took a collective Zoom picture of the kids with their vote signs, and we'll turn those into postcards so that these kids can write to registered voters in their area, or in places that we need an extra push. Because I think you're right. When you do get so much campaign literature or just advertisements in general, right? And to have something really speak to someone, it has to have some meaning and some authenticity to it. And I can't imagine a better way to reach someone than through the handwriting and thoughtfulness of kids sending out these postcards. And so can you talk a little bit about kind of the goals of Kids for Biden, when we're really wanting to make sure we give these kids the tools they need to be activists?
Yes, I think there are so many goals. One of them being educating kids on what the different issues are out there. There's a lot of them here in the news, things about Black Lives Matter or things about climate. But then, our next topic that we're thinking about is equal pay. Kids don't know as much about that. They don't know as much about the women's rights movement. And a lot of them don't even realize, even some of my seniors don't realize that women aren't necessarily paid the same as men. I remember the shock in my class this year when we talked about it, even though, the soccer team, the women's soccer team had been on the news and everyone had heard that, like the kids really were surprised that in private businesses and other places that aren't regulated by the government, that women don't have equal pay. So I think it's important to educate the kids about what are the issues out there. And then, they have a whole host of issues that they might choose that they want to be activists on. And I think that also another goal is, to have the parents be motivated, because when the kids are interested in it and then they're talking to their parents about it, then I think it gets the parents more motivated to go out and vote as well. And just the lifelong education for the kids, and when they become of voting age, their ability and they're realizing that it's very important to go out and vote. And so hopefully that will make them lifelong voters as well.
Yes, there's nothing more motivating, right, than to see your children or your grandchildren excited about something and energized about something. And I think that was the beauty too of the call, was was seeing that, and parents seeing that on their children's faces. And education is such a big component to Kids for Biden, because we're taking these really hard topics, right? I mean, we're not talking about the things that are easy, right? We're talking about the things that are hard. And we're having these discussions with kids in a very safe environment in which kids can ask honest questions. We got a lot of those honest questions, on Friday. And it was a really great place to start that discussion. And as you said, we'll continue these discussions, and we will never pick easy topics. Our next one will be equal pay, and I think we should go on from there. But we can do gun safety. We can do so many different things, because climate. I mean, all of these things are really things that impact these children's lives. And while they may not be of age to vote, every one of these issues that we're discussing directly impacts their lives. And I mean, I think first and foremost, education is key to that, and making sure, kids have the platform and the ability to learn about these tough topics, have the ability to ask hard questions in a safe place where they can be, armed with answers, and then let them be creative, right, on how they can become activists and leaders in their community on these important topics.
Yeah, I would love, with the equal pay education, to have them maybe write letters to their Congress. Well, in my district, it's a woman. In your district too.
Yes.
To write to the congresswomen about the equal pay issue, because hopefully in November we will have, a Democratic House, and cross our fingers, a Democratic Senate, and maybe some of this will actually get passed. And I think that the Congress people would love to see letters from children as well, young girls, young boys, talking about the fact that they think it's an important issue.
Every October in our house, I have 2 daughters, and we talk about, basically I quit working in October, right? Because if women get paid 80 cents to $1 in which a man gets paid, basically women could stop working in October, right? But that's really had an impact on them. I mean, they've been shocked, right? And I think too, when we, discuss the history of our country, and quite honestly, the history of the state in which we live in, it has been shocking to these kids, right? Because it's hard to believe that, in so many ways, the wrongs of the past have not been made right. And I think by educating these kids, right, we are hopefully doing what we can to set the new generation, younger generations, on a different path. And
Exactly.
that's the key to this, for sure. Can you talk a little bit? We just have, a few minutes left, but in this particular segment, and I just really want to talk about, the importance of this moment in time, because this is a hard moment in our country's history. And, a lot of these things that are going on, and we've seen the students and the kids protesting, the murder of George Floyd, and we're having these hard conversations right now that are so necessary. But can you talk a little bit about how you think this moment in time might impact these kids as they do become activists?
Well, I think this is different than, the same sorts of killings that happened a year or two before. The killing that comes to mind for me is Philando Castile, because that's when our family was still living in Minnesota, and our boys were old enough to understand what was going on, and they had all sorts of questions, and it was on the news. But then after that, there were, small protests in Minnesota, maybe a few protests other places around the U.S., but it didn't really become the viral news that George Floyd was. And the way, I think it possibly because of the fact that it was all on camera and we all saw it, and it was 8 minutes long, was one of the reasons. But also, I think that people are just tired of bad things happening and of equality of the United States not living up to their promise of equality. But the way that it spread around the world, I mean, I thought America was amazing and the things that were going on here and the marches that were going on here. But the way it's spread around the world, and it's caused people to talk about colonialism and slavery and how people are treated in other countries as well, and then statues coming down and things like that. I mean, that was just a touch point, I hope, for, you know, a movement that could really bring equality finally to the United States on so many levels, race and, you know, hopefully with women's rights and other things as well.
Well, and I think one of the things you stress so well on Friday, that we have to continue to push for a higher standard, because when you raise the standard, it raises the standard for everybody. And as we touch on, you know, in the future, pay equity and other issues of that nature, you know, it is going to be important that these kids do recognize their own power within them, and how they can use that on areas in which we need to push for, you know, social justice and equality. And I think that's one of the real gifts of this Kids for Biden group. And it's incredible to see so many kids come together. And real briefly, before we end this first segment, I want to ensure people learn more about this group. And you can go to joebiden.com to learn more about Joe Biden. But we have a Facebook page that's Kids for Biden. And so I would just invite everyone who's interested to learning more about ways in which your kids, your grandkids can get involved. Please follow it on Facebook, Kids for Biden on Facebook. So thank you again, Joan, for being with us right now. And we're going to go to our first PSA, but please stay with us and we'll be right back.
I got a crick in my neck, limp in my step, cramping in my muscles every time I try to flex. But I don't want to get on. It's very sad all that I can do was remember you. You know I usually stay now, but if you throw me love, I'll throw you some more.
Let me tell you about the toughest guy on earth. He does the work of 2 jobs, but only gets paid for one. He's tough enough to feed the man that gave him a lifetime of nourishment. He has the crazy strength to lift the man that raised him up without even flinching. That's right. No Employee of the Month bonus check here. This guy, no, this warrior, will always be by his father's side, even if his dad will hardly remember. Good luck finding a gym to train for that. If this guy isn't the toughest guy on the planet, then I don't know who is. Caregiving is tougher than tough. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
When I was your age, I was just like you, fascinated by stars. But now I get to search for life in the universe. And who knows, maybe life is looking for us too.
So we're like aliens to them?
Yeah. Does anyone want to be a scientist now?
I do.
Awesome. We need more girls in STEM.
Maybe we can find aliens.
What are you looking for?
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Lindsay Davis Stover, and we're continuing our conversation with Joan Lewis Osborne, who is a volunteer for Kids for Biden and who is an AP government teacher in Loudoun County. Joan, thank you again for being with us this evening.
Thank you.
Well, we finished our first segment talking about the event we had on Friday and the importance of having hard conversations with kids right now and how eager kids are to learn as much as they can about the history of our country and what's going on at this moment in time. And we did a lot around Juneteenth on Friday in terms of educating kids about what it really means and what it has stood for and the history of that particular day. And I think it was such an important lesson, not just for kids tuning in, but for many adults, because we had the conversation that so much of the actual history is not in our history books. So I'd love for you to go into the history of the day, because I think it's such an important lesson for kids and adults alike.
So Juneteenth is so important to African Americans because it is really the day that a lot of former slave or a lot of enslaved people became free. And the reason why is because the Emancipation Proclamation didn't really free the slaves. And so it took the Union Army advancing into the South for slaves to actually be free. But another complication of that was that Southern slaveholders who wanted to escape the Union Army took their slaves to Texas. So they were across the Mississippi. They were in a more isolated Confederate state. And then they could shield their slaves from being freed that way. And I actually had a great-great-grandmother who was born in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and then moved as a 3 or 4 year old child to Texas by her slaveholder so that they could continue to keep them in slavery. So after the Confederates surrendered in April of 1865, there were still hundreds of thousands of slaves in Texas. Some people think it's between 250 and 300,000 slaves that were still in Texas. They don't have really good numbers, and part of it's because of the movement. So what happened was the Union Army was occupying the rest of the South, but they weren't occupying the state of Texas. So they sent General George Granger, who actually had become known as a hero for saving the Union Army from horrible defeat at the Battle of Chickamauga. And he was down finishing up his campaign in Mobile, Alabama, which was the perfect place for the Union to launch troops to go to occupy Texas, because they were getting ready to enforce basically the occupation of the South by the Reconstruction Union Army. So on June 5th, the federal government started planning what they were going to do in order to take over Texas and let the slaveholders in Texas know that it was time for their slaves to be freed. And so they told Granger, he had troops down there, they got them ready because they were sending them by boat to Galveston Island. And then it was on June 19th that Granger took the troops to Galveston Island and made General Order Number 3, the announcements. He actually had several different announcements that he made, but the announcement that regarded the freedom of the slaves was called General Order Number 3. And it had specific language that I really want to read, because it's more than just saying that the slaves are free. And this really surprised a lot of people when they looked back on the history. So the actual order said, quote, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. And the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. So not only did they say they were free, they said that they were equal to their masters. And that was a huge surprise. And it was also something that Granger and the other Southern generals, or the other American generals that were in the South, thought that they had to say, because there was this idea that the masters would be able to keep the slaves on their plantation. And there was a question as to whether they would be paying them or not, because even though the Confederates surrendered in April, the Southerners in Texas kept their slaves and they made them plant the crops. And so now it's June, and the question was, are they going to be on the plantations still, and are they going to be paid for harvesting the crops in the fall? And of course, a lot of the owners didn't want them to be paid. So Granger had to make it really clear that they're equal to you now. They're not slaves anymore. If you want their labor, you're going to have to pay them. So that was something that was really, really different. The other thing they wanted them to know, that he wanted them to know, was that slaves could choose, if they wanted, to remain on their master's lands, because they were really afraid that hundreds of thousands of people would leave, and then it would be a disaster, because it'd be a mass migration of people to where they didn't know. So they wanted people to know that if they wanted to stay on there and work, and they could work out a deal with their master to get paid for it, that was okay. So that actually prevented a lot of slaves, former slaves, from being displaced. But General Granger came to Galveston, and because the Union troops were occupying Galveston, then a lot of the slaves, all of the slaves in Galveston, were immediately freed. That wasn't the case in other parts of Texas. The Union Army had to move up further north, and it took longer for some of those slaves to be freed. I mean, no one thinks about the size of Texas. It's huge. I mean, it takes you longer to drive from the northern part of Texas down to Galveston than it does sometimes to drive from the middle of the United States out to the East Coast. Absolutely. So it's a huge state, and for the Army to occupy and, make sure that everyone was doing what they're supposed to do was really quite a task. So Granger has become very famous. People still remember him. And he's probably more well known for Juneteenth now than he was for, being the hero of Chickamauga. But the Juneteenth celebration started actually in Galveston on that day. There are actually historical accounts, and he just said, let them have fun and celebrate their freedom. And then the next year, it became a more formal thing. And by the end of the 1800s in Texas, people had certain things that they ate on Juneteenth. So they always had barbecue. They had red food. So red, they say, represents like the blood of their ancestors that they gave for the country and to be free. So they always have watermelon. And even though that sort of got a stigma earlier in the 1900s, people are bringing it back. They're like, no, like we own this. Like watermelon's actually really tasty and it represents something. So they're starting to do that again. And also people eat red soda. You'll see people with red shirts on. So red is like one of the really important colors for Juneteenth. But especially in places where there are a lot of people from Texas, and Minnesota is one of those. During the Great Migration, lots of people came up to Minnesota from Texas. The Juneteenth celebrations are wonderful. They have bands, they have live music, dancing, they have speeches, they have contests around it before, art contests and things like that. So it's really a full community event. And I was really happy that even though, we were just getting out of lockdown in DC on Juneteenth last Friday, they had marches, and actually they weren't rained out. I saw some of them on television, and people were marching for civil rights and equal rights, which I think is a wonderful way to commemorate Juneteenth.
And so many service projects also went on Friday.
Exactly.
And service projects are looking a little bit different, just given so much of the country is not fully reopened yet. But I loved not only the emphasis on equality and marching and justice, but there was also a huge emphasis placed on service. I thought that was an incredible way to celebrate the day.
Yes. And I think it's really important when you were saying, what can we teach kids? Service is something that's really important to teach kids. Like from us being a young child, my mother always was volunteering and having us volunteer and, give things away. And she had huge gardens, like, acres of gardens, and she would give that food away and give it to the food bank and things like that. So, when you learn that as a child, then you will continue doing that as an adult. And I mean, to make this a more perfect union, to make our country a better place, you really need those little hands doing service projects and big hands.
Yes, that's so right. So right. And, what I loved about your lesson on Friday was so much of it was new to people, right? And the details of it were in so many ways new to people because they aren't in the full lesson isn't in our textbooks in this country. And unfortunately, it hasn't been conversations that many families have had, but this one felt different. This year, it felt different. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know a lot about the conversations we've had with younger kids and how to talk to younger kids about this moment in time and about equality and justice. But can you talk a little bit about how to talk to older kids right now?
Sure. I have 2 teenagers, and so, they are on social media, and they saw right away, I think it was my son that's going to be a senior who came running down the stairs to tell me what had happened, and it just took my breath away. But right away, we had to start talking to them about it. We had to start talking to them about the fact that you two are young Black males in America, and sadly, this is the sort of thing that could happen to you. And I've talked to them, since they were much younger about, what to do if you're pulled over by a police officer and to try to comply with what they want you to do. Even if they tell you to get out of the car and you don't think that's necessary, do it. And it's because of, unfortunately, the history of policing in the United States. So we've had a lot of talks with them about policing in the United States, about equality and the lack thereof for certain people. We've talked about implicit bias. They're much older, so you can have those conversations with them about the really important issues, and they're able to process it. One movie that I really, documentary that I really love that illustrates a lot of this and that teenagers can watch. Some teachers show it in school. I'm thinking about showing it this coming year, is the movie 13th. Because that's at the end of the Civil War. It talks about the 13th Amendment and freeing the slaves, and then it talks about the institutional racism that came out of it with basically the prison system, the forced labor system. And it talks about a lot of the race issues that are happening in the United States today, being, carried over from the lack of really giving people their civil rights after the Civil War, and then even after the Civil Rights Movement, not really treating everyone equally and fairly. So I think that with older kids, you can have those conversations, and then you can go out and try to educate yourself. And one thing that I would love to do on Kids for Biden is have, links to certain readings and videos and things that people can watch with their kids, for younger kids and for older kids as well, that will help parents, educate themselves and educate their children and be able to have these conversations.
I mean, I'm so glad you brought up policing, because I know that is a topic that we've discussed before and possibly could be a topic that we cover Kids for Biden. And you've talked a lot about how you talk about it in your classroom. how are some of those conversations going to change now moving forward?
It will make it a much more urgent conversation, I think. I remember when I first started teaching it in the classroom, it was probably about 2011 or 2012, and there hadn't been any of these really big cases out there. And so we talk about it with respect to the Fourth and Fifth Amendment, and then getting pulled over, and getting searched. Because where I taught before, at least, was mostly a white area. There weren't that many minority kids. And although we did have kids from other states who went to the school, and they would tell me stories about things that had happened to them as teenagers when they got pulled over. So we were focusing on that. And then suddenly the Philando Castile incident happened, and he was shot, and everyone saw the video. All the kids saw the video. And so one kid asked me, and he was actually from Virginia, he said, "What should you do if you have a gun in the car?" He goes, "If you have your own permit for the gun." And he was actually talking about his dad. And so I had to sit back and think, and I actually contacted a friend of mine who's a lawyer. And he's like, that's the sad thing. He said, I would have told them before the Philando Castile incident to do exactly what Philando Castile said. Tell the officer, I have a weapon in the car, and I have a permit for the weapon. And do exactly what he did. But unfortunately, he did do everything right, and it did not turn out the way it should have for him. Instead he was killed. So ever since that incident, we've really talked a lot more about policing, a lot more about just compliance, staying calm. One of my friends that's a lawyer said, keep your hands on the steering wheel at all times, until they ask you for something or to do something, and then do it. If they ask you to get out of the car, get out of the car. But with teenagers, we've really had some very in-depth and very interesting conversations. And then, like I said, some of the African-American teenagers will tell me stories about things that happened to them. And one boy from Iowa had a horrible story about staying late at a friend's house. He lived in Des Moines, Iowa. And so he said normally he would have just driven through the city streets to get back home, but it was late and he didn't want to be out past curfew. So he got on the highway, and then the police saw him, pulled him over, and they did a felony stop. They came to him with 2 police cars behind his car, their lights on. They had him come out of the car, put his hands in the air, and they had their guns drawn. And he was just like a teenage kid trying to get home. And once they realized, they looked at his ID and they realized his age. They're like, well, you're out past curfew. And he's like, well, that's why I'm on this road. Because I was trying to get home, so that I wouldn't miss curfew. So when you hear kids tell stories like that, you have to stop class and you have to have a conversation about race. And other kids completely understood. They were like, that would have never happened to me. I see my privilege as a young white kid. I've never been pulled over and even told to get out of the car, much less in a felony situation like that when you're just an innocent kid. So many topics can be covered when you have these sort of deeper conversations, and especially when kids tell you things that have actually happened to them.
And I think you bring up a really good point, right? And recognizing in your class the white kids in particular that realize that most likely would never happen to them, right? And having those conversations and building those relationships, right, I think is so key. And we've talked a lot about the importance of education. But can you talk also about the importance of building these relationships so that the education and the conversations really can be had?
That's such a good point. You really have to, at the beginning of the school year, meet with your students and create an atmosphere and talk about, norms for the class and make it a safe space for kids to talk on both sides of issues. And that's one thing that I have to tell kids. I'm like, this country is built on freedom of speech, freedom of expression. I was like, you absolutely need to sit here and listen to people's opinions, and I don't want you to make negative comments about them. Like, everyone has a right to say what they think. Maybe later on, after you say something, they'll change their mind based on what you said. But, you know, in order to have a conversation, you have to first have like norms that this is a safe space for kids to talk about different issues. And I found out, like, when I was talking about the equal pay issue, when I brought it up in class, one kid just yelled out, one of the boys yelled out, "That's not true." He's like, "Women get paid the same thing as men." And so I said, okay, let's step back a little bit. I said, so why do you think women get paid the same thing as men? He goes, "Oh, well, I work construction. And in there," and I said, "You know what?" I was like, "I bet you anything that the company you work for does government work." I was like, in companies that contract with the government, they have to have like a pay scale and everyone gets paid the same. I was like, "But that's not the case everywhere." And he was just shocked. And then we watched a little clip from a movie about that. And he was like, "I never knew this." And then he went back home, I guess, and had a discussion with his stepmother. And he came back and he said, "My stepmother said you're 100% right. I never knew that." So I think with kids, a lot of times it's just an education piece. And if you do it with, you know, you're not judging them, you're just saying, well, these are the facts. And maybe if you can even show them a little bit of a movie or something about it, they will get it. And I love the openness of the kids that I teach. I mean, it gives me hope for this generation. We have a lot of difficult discussions, but in the end, I notice that the kids are pretty much still getting along. So that I think really helps, and it does give me hope.
That's so great. And, you know, we talked a little bit on Friday during the event about ending with the Biden speech. And in terms of building bridges and giving hope and creating that dialogue, we saw Joe Biden do that in so many ways when he delivered his speech at George Floyd's funeral. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because as we prepare the Kids for Biden group and start posting things on the Facebook page of educational tools, I know in particular that speech will be one of the things that we post. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of that speech, the importance of building bridges right now, and how you think Joe Biden's able to do that?
I was so moved when I saw that speech. I had seen the earlier services that they had for Mr. Floyd in Minneapolis, and then I watched the ones in Houston, and I was crying at several points. And that speech was one of the points that I started to cry, because Vice President Biden is trying to bring the country together. He's trying to have people focus on what they have in common with other people. We have our values that, you know, we put forth at the founding of this country of liberty and equality and freedom and independence. But I think really equality and justice are the things that are most important right now. And when he said in the speech, you know, where's the justice? You know, justice is supposed to be rolling down, and it's not. And a lot of people just feel so hopeless at this point because of that. And I think to have a leader who comes out and speaks on it and talks about the hard issues and says, you know, we need to come together as a country. We need to get back to some of those values that we founded this country on so that we can find common ground and get beyond this and start working on all the other many, you know, problems that we have in this country that we need to work on.
Well, you know, that speech gave many adults hope.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about how it too can give kids hope when they sit down, and maybe they weren't able to see it in real time, but when they sit down with their parents, their grandparents, their loved ones, and watch that clip. Can you talk about the importance of that hope for younger generations?
I think it's really important because if you looked at what happened in Minneapolis after the killing and, you know, the way that things were burnt down, like, kids were scared. I have family members that still live there, and they were very frightened. They were like, you know, I look out my window at night and I see fires like all around me. So there's a lot of fear there. And if you can have someone sit down and watch a speech, and I know my nephew watched it with my sister, and they can see that there's someone out there who's running for president, who hopefully we are going to get elected, who knows what these issues are and is going to talk to leaders in those cities and all around the country and try to get legislation passed that will change this problem. I think that makes kids feel like there's hope for them, and I think it also possibly gets them excited about working to get these changes put in place and to get Vice President Biden elected.
You brought up such an important point, and I've seen it happen with my two daughters almost immediately, is the fear that they feel right now that I don't remember them ever feeling before, quite honestly. And and that fear is such a powerful thing and can have such an impact on children in so many ways. And it will be interesting to see how children right now take maybe some of the fear that they've had over the last year, 2-3 years, and how they turn that into action. Because I think that piece of it in particular is going to be so important, because fear has dominated in so many ways the childhood of these generations right now.
That's true. We were talking about this 2020 class. They were born right after 9/11. Like, they have seen so many things. And then to have the Parkland shooting happen and to have them like turn that around into a movement, we have to get that passed. We need to honor what those kids were doing. And I think this younger generation that's protesting with Black Lives Matter and other groups as well, I think that, we need to work as hard as we can as parents to get the right people in office so that these kids' dreams can be realized.
That's right. And that takes us, and we just have a few seconds left, but that takes us to the importance of voting. And so I just invite everyone watching today, if you're not registered to vote in November, please register, get to the polls and vote, because that is the best way your voice is counted. And this, in so many ways, is going to be one of the most important elections of our lifetime. So I would just invite everyone to register to vote, get to the polls in November to vote. And if you're interested in learning more about Biden, Kids for Biden, please follow us on Facebook. Also, if you're interested in learning more about Joe Biden, please go to joebiden.com. Thank you for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you again soon. Good night.